space is absolutely beautiful. Here, you guys have wonderful facilities. The being able to see all the work together has really been exciting for me because I haven't seen this quantity of work put together before in one space. So being able to walk through, it does feel a little bit like a retrospect that is kind of weird because I don't feel like I'm at that stage yet. But it's been really cool. So I'm very honored to be here this morning, and thank you for coming. In addition to drawing and painting, I am also a professor at Valdosta State University, and I teach the drawing classes there, foundation classes, figure drawing classes, and I'll be teaching a painting one class next semester as well. All right. In preparing this talk, I polled my drawing classes to see what they would most be interested in listening to during an artist talk, and the overwhelming majority of responses stressed the artist's process, the story behind the work, the inspiration. So out of the 50 plus pieces that are out there, I've chosen to share the stories behind 5 of the series that kind of make up a lot of the exhibition here. Together, they span around 8 years of research. I've included concept sketches for you to gain some insight on the genesis while providing me the vulnerable space to share my thought process and inspiration. Before I get started, I'd like to read a very brief artist statement that I think will provide the context and intent of my work as we move forward. My art is about my humble attempts to ask the right questions and plant seeds of beauty for illuminating thoughts and discussion. I collect moments of revelation and try to visually give them away as a drawing or a painting. Hoping to motivate the viewer to reassess things typically taken for granted, I see art as a catalyst for a great discussion. Art asks questions, and dialogue with people should lead to answers. Beginning in 2008, I was challenged to consider my work as more than just a personal journal, which it had been for up to that point. How would my work exist in the real world as an object? And why should it exist? I figured it was safe to claim art exists because something deserves or needs to be noticed or appreciated. So I began by asking myself, what do people notice and why? And what do people ignore and why? I wondered if I could create an experience where someone would feel ignored when they walked into a space. And this was intriguing to me, especially considering that I claimed art exists for the recognition and appreciation of something. It seemed sort of antithetical. So I decided to create life-size portraits of people turned away from the viewer, denying eye contact, and fill a gallery space with as many as possible. Something amazing happened when I did that. It didn't work. This series is composed of 16 non-traditional portraits. Each life-size drawing represents a person's head, back, and shoulders. The charcoal drawings are mounted on canvas that sits on the wall like a stage, unsheltered by glass. Viewers of this series tend to feel they are sharing a gaze as part of a group, and the drawings, surprisingly, have a unifying effect, which wasn't what I had hoped for, but I was pleasantly surprised by. The white space connects each portrait and can be read as a marvelous light in the spiritual realm or a white void of nothingness. The presence of these drawings became an invitation to look. The common experience of waiting in a checkout line provided common ground to receive the work as an opportunity to study the subject in an intimate space. Like arriving at the conclusion that one of these subjects maybe they own a cat or a dog because of the animal hair present on their shirt, viewers could become part of the group while remaining the voyeur. Providing the viewer with an active sense of the anonymous gives the viewer permission to safely join the group, engage, and project oneself into the work. The anonymity becomes a capacitor for reflection. The content is open enough for the viewer to project his or her own assumptions to questions that remain unanswered, like what are they looking at? Why are they waiting, or what are they waiting for? Or why are they there? Who are they? Then more questions arise. What do people ignore and why? What do they notice and why? Viewers multiply and sustain the work by the mere act of looking. It's repetitive. We're looking at the backs of someone, looking at the backs of someone else, and etc. To disengage the piece and walk away sets you apart from the group. There's a certain inclusive versus exclusive experience that intrigues me here. There's a concealed identity, a veiling, plus a personal and public duality that led my research forward to the box series. Isn't that funny? It's a weird reference there. Like my previous series, the box series began with the question, why and how do we hide? I wanted to deal with isolation and compartmentalizing. Veiling and distance from the viewer became significant while questioning what feels safe and comfortable. I asked friends to wear huge cardboard boxes of my own construction and model for me, and it was pretty ridiculous in the process. We had a lot of laughs, and it was also intermixed with these awkward moments of silence while I was taking the picture and asking them to be still. It was pretty weird. I saw the box as an empty container for meaning, a metaphorical void for the viewer to fill with his or her own projections. I believe we are created with a need for community and communication beyond ourselves. So I created scenarios where the figure was clearly limited by the level of interaction they could have with another human being unless they shared a box with someone. At this point, I began establishing a purpose for the work I create, to ask meaningful questions. Within my own struggles for my work to reach out, or for my own work to reach out and make the personal something both accessible and local, I found this series addressing the same issue. Asking questions is a great way to encounter someone's inner dialogue with the hope of understanding them. It's seeking common ground in a person's heart, not the box. The metaphor of the box and spaces broadened as this series progressed. As viewers began to ask what the box meant and what was going on inside, the planes of color became psychological. The figures were inhabiting a form of faith, lies, identity, limitations, secrets, a false belief system, or just a limited perspective. Mental space and spiritual space became a focus by replacing the background of my photographic reference with one hue and capturing a sense of the non-objective within the rendering of the box surface. I have a love for mark making and found a place to enjoy myself within the gesture and glazing techniques employed to render these paintings. After completing the first 4 box paintings, I recognized the same inclusivity versus exclusivity from the Notice series reappearing, but these paintings acted more as a presentation addressing the box rather than an invitation to join or enter the box. There was distance from the viewer and space to contemplate the image as a carrier of meaning. The invisible versus visible came into play and ran parallel with what I was reading at the time. We have lost an awareness of the invisible and eternal, says A.W. Tozer in his book, The Attributes of God, Volume 1. The world is too much with us so that the invisible and the eternal seem to be quite forgotten, or at least we're not aware of it. We're only briefly aware of it when somebody dies. The aware of the eternal carried me forward into the hymn series. Such awareness should be present within the heart of worship. I began to ask myself if the temporal could touch the eternal, and I found a connection in songs of worship. As human beings, we are glued to time. We are inherently designed for the eternal, yet everything we do can appear to fall short within the temporal. Everything we sing, everything we say, even acts of service can be very limited or measured through time. They are temporal. Yet, amidst this framework of time, we live with the hope of eternal realities and the gifts of a God who neither slumbers nor sleeps, but exists in the eternal now. Our worship of God stands at this crossroad. I began to think of a paper airplane as a metaphor for temporality, and the bent edges and crinkled tips are evidence revealing the temporal quality of a song, even as it touches the eternity in our hearts. They are the evidence, through metaphor, of an attempt to connect with the eternal God. Constructing this plane from the page of a hymnal seemed appropriate. However, process should reflect intent. Poor consideration of form and function could run the risk of presenting an idea without any life rather than presenting the truth in love. I purposely drew each stage of the airplane's construction to record my own act of looking, seeing and shaping a vehicle of intended worship to also carry with it a sense of transformation like old becoming new. A hymn page turned paper airplane did seem appropriate, yet potentially disrespectful, but only as much as a child presents ineloquent and limited vocabulary to a parent in the attempt to tell them that they are loved. Although these songs are directed to the heavens, they are measured by time and destined to end. Yet in worship, our experience of the beauty of God yields another song to beckon our hearts toward the eternal once again. Starting in 2014, the beauty of God led me to seek out biblical references of bread within the collection of 66 books historically recognized as the Holy Bible. I began to see the Last Supper as the ultimate example of performance art, uniting the past, present, and future into one moment in time. Provision seemed to be at the heart of bread in biblical contexts. Works in this series revolve around the question of hungers, present and ongoing, thirst physical and spiritual. Bread can speak to abundance and the power to provide, while hinting at a bread eternally provisional and one who answers the supreme hunger of life. The Last Supper speaks to Christ himself being the sacrifice for our sins and nourishment for our groaning that gives us all eternal significance and a reunited relationship with our Creator now and beyond death. In its initial sketch, this painting titled New Covenant focused on Christ's words, "This is my body broken for you, and this is my blood shed for you." Compositionally, I chose to arrange these sacrificial symbols to reference the Abrahamic covenant. Found in the book of Genesis, chapter 15, Abraham followed God's instruction to split animal carcasses and create a ceremonial agreement between the two of them. Passing between the sacrifice committed that person as responsible to follow through with the stated agreement, even to the point of death. God alone passed between the pieces to establish an unconditional covenant with Abraham and did not allow Abraham to play any additional role. Through Jesus, God fulfilled that covenant with his death on the cross. The way bread is referenced through Christ in the Gospels is fascinating. The common sharing of meals with Jesus is an affirmation of his humanity, of our materiality, even as his resisting the temptation to turn stones to bread reminds us that we are more than what we eat. While referencing a contemporary version of bread, I began to envision this temptation and paint a stone turning into bread. I've found that Christ offers a space where the ordinary and ephemeral and the extraordinary and eternal intersect. I employed a traditional process of underpainting for this work to build up levels of glaze and detail until I arrived at a convincing image. As you can see in the slide, my son took part and helped with the underpainting. His name's Lincoln. This painting depicts the what-if scenario. What if Jesus turned stone to bread during that temptation? Surely he could imagine the process. Surely he could satisfy physical need immediately. Jesus saw through the temptation, answering that humanity does not live on bread alone, but from every word that comes from the mouth of God. The work hopes to offer imaginative food for thought. Christ continues to feed and care for his creation, working within the loving purposes of God, continually redirecting us to that which ultimately gives us life. In this wondrous power of God that instructs our birth, growth, and continued existence in daily life, the creative process of photosynthesis is itself God's extended breath of life into the world. Jesus turning water into wine or multiplying bread continues to speak of God as creator. Creation is filled with the glory of a creative God. God creates DNA and provides inherent instruction for a strand to duplicate itself. Depending on the type of cell housing the DNA, somewhere between 1 and 24 hours a cell multiplies by division. On a larger scale, plants and insects, animals and people multiply. There's a language for multiplication, and the author is our Heavenly Father. In John chapter 6, Jesus fed a multitude of over 5,000 people with just 2 fish and 5 barley loaves. With the help of C.S. Lewis, I've been able to appreciate that God performs great and wonderful things like turning water into wine or multiplying fish and barley on a regular basis through biological processes. For this piece, I composed slices of bread, hoping a slice would be easier to recognize from a distance than a loaf of bread, and 2 fish in a way that mimics the anaphase of mitosis, a part of a cell cycle. I don't pretend to understand the miracle, but I do believe that the same one who multiplied fish and bread to feed us also works in us to physically grow us and spiritually mature us. As he calls himself in John 6:35, Jesus is the bread of life, and he fills more than our stomachs. He defines all other hungers for us and fulfills our deepest needs of meaning and belonging. He does this with abundance, and it's been his style since the beginning of time. So I've attempted to be as linear as possible with the presentation of these works and the series they coincide with, but truth be told, many of them do overlap. The last series I'll speak about actually started in 2012, but much like the box series and the bread series, I found myself returning and increasing their breadth. I began my teaching career in 2011 And by the end of my second semester teaching, I felt that life as a college professor can be overwhelming and extraneous responsibilities, and with extraneous responsibilities beyond teaching and research. Now, supervene is defined as to come or occur as something extraneous, additional, or unexpected. So these superventions are the extras or distractions of life, even false responsibilities that steal our time away from what's important. And that is the question concerning this series. What is important? The work represents a swirling demand of chasing the wind that we have to emerge from to see reality and experience truth. In the book of Ecclesiastes, there's a familiar phrase referring to meaninglessness. But and here's the quote, "But as I looked at everything I had worked so hard to accomplish, it was all so meaningless, like chasing the wind. There was nothing really worthwhile anywhere." This series depicts figures veiled by visual manifestations of thoughts or seemingly important responsibilities. The manifestations represent anything without eternal significance that gets in the way of our ability to see reality, to see and to set priorities in an appropriate hierarchy. These are supervening thoughts, questions, worries, concerns, anxieties, pleasures, distractions, and rabbit trails we consume on an hourly basis. In contrast, these aren't little victories of thought that amount to creative distractions leading to greater problem-solving abilities. No, these are the things that make you forget what's important and shirk responsibility. These are things that will lead to breaking vows and forgetting commitments. They seem to exist as or create a slightly different reality. They veil truth, prohibit growth, and they may even cause an atrophy of critical thought. Behind this veil, we tend to acquire a false sense of busyness, importance, or purpose. In their creation, these pieces became therapeutic for me, allowing me to emote frustration and remind myself that there is no such thing as an art school emergency. I originally envisioned these pieces as life-size portraits similar to the Notice series, but after experimenting with image transfers on a much smaller scale, it became clear that smaller felt more relatable, more real for the concept. As a group, may these pieces set themselves up as reminders to stay vigilant, stay the course, and finish the race. Reminders that we are all one selfish, prideful, or poor choice away from trading real, meaningful moments of life for temporary pleasures. We can relate with the feelings these pieces connote. We've all felt this way at one point. The devil comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but Jesus brings life abundant. These things aren't the end. They are symptoms of a greater need. While I see them as warning signs of cupidity and displaced identity, there have been more positive interpretations. I've been delighted to converse with others who have received any of my work in a different way and found radically different applications. I tell my students that a work of art isn't really functioning or complete until it's beheld by eyes of others, hopefully connecting to their heart and their mind. Now, you've just given me the honor of sharing my intentions and personal interpretations. You've been generous with your attention, and I'm interested in hearing your answers to these questions. So maybe we'll have the chance to talk one-on-one. But until then, thank you. Alrighty. So last night we did have a little bit of a time for some Q&A, and I'm welcome to, do that now as well. Or we could walk out into the gallery space if you had specific questions about any of the pieces in there, whether it's about process or intent or anything really. And I'm happy to do that. So do you guys have a preference? I don't see Vivian right now, so.
Does anybody have any questions while we're here?
It's okay, it's early, it's Friday. I get that. Yeah.
Talk about the importance of mark making in your work.
Mark making, yeah, I love the physicality of it. I think just the impression of I was here, and this is it becomes naturally when you're recording anything by sight. There's this record of looking, but there's something about a gesture that you can't fake. So whether that's coming from the heart as I'm making it, or just the intention or the circumstances under which I'm having to make the piece. Standing vertically, maybe in reference to music or some talk or something that I'm listening to. But mostly the passion in creating the work, and in a little bit of a sense being impatient about getting the work made at the same time, does render these gestures that are super exciting to me. If it's like really clean, crisp, and absolutely perfect, it's not as exciting. Although obviously I do love to render, and there's stuff out there that's, could be closely related to as a photograph. When you get close up to it, it does begin to break down, and I love that breaking.
I noticed in some of your photographs that you had in your space, you were working on like multiple, like in your box series, you had several different images that you were, or works that you were working on at the same time. Do you have a process for that, or do you try to set up where you see where the whole collection is going to go, or is it just kind of?
Oh, that's a great question. I've found through the years that if I work on more than one piece at the same time, and like my sweet spot is 4, if I can make room for it, I'm just quicker and more productive, and then there's a more cohesive flow and relatability between the works as well. So it's almost like, well, if you're challenged to figure out a composition in a drawing class, and you're looking at the still life, and you've done your thumbnail sketches, and you've got things together, normally I think you would be instructed to begin to plot out the extremes of shadow shapes as you go, all across the composition, not just work in one single area and maybe begin to spread out. And I think working on one piece at a time is that sense of working in just that one area and slowly beginning to spread. But working on multiple pieces at one time is like looking at the entire composition and trying to make sure things are cohesive. So I've found that it not just speeds me up, but I even have almost like more fuel for the fire. I can limit myself to like 25 minutes to work on this piece, and if I'm regimented enough and sort of OCD about it, time myself for like 25 minutes, and when the buzzer goes off, I drop that and go on to the next piece and begin to work. And I've found that pretty liberating as far as speed and exploration with what I'm really trying to do. So it does cause me to plan a little bit more in advance, like, well, I don't need to just have this photo reference or this still life in front of me, but I've got to have several. So the prep time might take a little bit away, but it's worth the investment for the pieces to come out kind of back to back.
When do you work best? Do you work best in the morning, night? When are you allowed?
When do I work best? I am a father of 3, and of course I teach at Valdosta State as well. So like I work best whenever I can like carve out the time, and I have to take the most advantage of the time that I have. There's so many other responsibilities to juggle. It can be pretty challenging. I've got an 8-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 2-year-old at home as well, and they're my life. So it's tough to balance. So in the past it's turned into, okay, school's done, dinner's done, kids are in bed, let me run off to the studio for a little bit and maybe get 2 or 3 hours worth of work done before coming home to go to bed. Or it could be that, oh good, I've gotten classes done before noon because of the schedule this semester, and so between noon and 5 when I would return home, if I can knock some other normal grading or whatever stuff out of the way, then I've got a chunk of time that I can spend in my office, which I've somewhat converted into a studio space as well. So I just take what I can get and run with it. In my current situation, I work within the studios that's available in the class. Sometimes I even create work alongside my students, which you have to be careful about because you can get caught up and ignore the students, and that's the bad part. The good part is that on work days when they're supposed to be creating, you can create right alongside with them, and there's more of a sense of camaraderie and the opportunity to look and see, well, what's he doing? How did he do that? Maybe I can do it that way too. And sort of like sharing technique without really having to say anything is kind of nice. So sometimes I work in the classroom, sometimes I work in my office, which doubles as a studio, and sometimes I work at home. Good questions.
We were talking about last night about setting up, because I mean that's something that all students, and I've been dealing with forever students,
Yeah, the studio is probably one of the most important places you could be in your college career. I mean, that's where the magic's going to happen, and if it doesn't happen there, it's going to happen when you're buried into visual or textual research of some kind, and that research should be stuff that's blowing your hair back. It should be things that you're passionate about. If you can take your passion and then commit to the importance of your work in that disciplined format, like being as regimented as you can just to create a routine, and then the routine will become normal, and then that feels, it'll wind up being a habit that feels part of you. You'll have a certain inner expectation for yourself to continue to push, rather than relying on moments of inspiration when that's unreliable. And you really you got to show up first to make things happen. Great. All right. Well, let's mingle around in the gallery space. If there's anything, I'll be out there to answer like one-on-one questions if you want. And feel free. But thank you for having me. It's been an awesome time being here.